Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Therapy by the Book, the show where we take your favorite fictional characters and ask the question, what would it be like if they came to therapy? My name is William Haddad, and today we're doing a solo episode. I'm going to be journeying across the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to London, circa 1897, for a referral with a young man named Jonathan Harker from Dracula. The Dracula novel is one of the, I think, best horror novels out there today. And considering when it was written, that's really saying something. The lore that it has inspired across all mediums, from film, television, and other novelizations and adaptations, both within the realm of the original story and, of course, within the numerous other areas of stories that we've seen ever since, is extraordinary. And yet, somehow, to top it off, this novel itself, I think, still sets the bar at another level for how creepy it is. It's an incredibly dark story. It really is the, to vampire stories what The Godfather is to mafia stories, or what Eiji Yoshikawa's Musashi is to samurai stories. So to be doing a therapy session with Jonathan Harker, who is he? He's one of the protagonists in the story. We're introduced to him solely through entries in shorthand written in his journal that he keeps during his travels. We don't know a whole lot about his childhood going into the story, but we do know that as a young man, he's an English gentleman by most standards of the day. He has a polite but firm outlook. He's not necessarily swayed by simple words. You usually need a good argument to convince him to change his mind or think differently about something. But he's very well-intentioned and very courteous to those that he encounters. His job is working for, I believe, a English firm that's involved largely in real estate dealings. And it's on the orders of this firm that he is sent up all the way to Transylvania in order to deal with one of the firm's rather enigmatic clients, the mysterious Count Dracula. Now, on his way up to meet with the Count, who's apparently been making a lot of purchases in the London and England area for property, he records in his diary everything that is happening to him on the way up. So we see that he's quite observant. He has observations about the local cultures, that he speaks a couple of different languages, both French and German, which he uses to communicate with some of the people when English is no longer an option. And as he goes farther and farther up into the mountains, things get darker and creepier very quickly. And ultimately, even before he finally reaches the castle of Count Dracula, there's a lot of very scary signs that something is off. And what was supposed to turn into a simple business trip then becomes a waking nightmare for him. In Castle Dracula, though he's greeted politely by the Count, he soon becomes a prisoner in the castle itself. He's confined to his room at night. He's warned by Dracula never to fall asleep in anywhere that's not his room. And he also starts to see some very unsettling sights in the strange atmosphere of the place. Wolves howling at night, rooms that are old and broken down and dusty that don't seem to have any clear purpose. And on top of that, he has a real shock when only a couple nights after he's arrived, he sees the Count himself crawling around the castle walls, up and down on the steep vertical walls of the castle at nighttime. And from there, it just gets worse. He's subjected to visions. He starts to question his own sanity. He eventually, despite trying to resist, ends up falling asleep out of exhaustion in another room and wakes up to discover several female vampires, Dracula's brides, starting to try to drink his blood. And eventually the amount of blood that they drain it slowly, but it keeps him weak and it takes away his strength. So all of this supernatural torture and imprisonment, just a ton of damage that's being done to his mind as well as his body during this scary journey that he has in Castle Dracula. One of his diary entries in the book actually opens with the phrase, "God preserve my sanity." So he's really struggling to even just admit to himself that all of these terrible things are happening. So you have a lot of fear, a lot of very real life or death situations, Naturally, this is going to be leading to quite a bit of trauma, which we'll get into momentarily. Eventually, he does escape. It takes a huge effort, but he manages to break out of the castle, and he heals a little at a church that's down the river a ways, and is eventually reunited with his wife-to-be, Mina, who has been all this time waiting for news of him back in London. But even after he finally reunites with her and is able to marry her, he still finds himself tormented by everything from memory lapses to anxiety to constant bouts of physical illness. And though this isn't the word used in the book, as a clinician, we would call it flashbacks. It's fascinating because we hear it in some sense more from Mina's perspective, because one of the cool things about the story of Dracula is that it's not just Jonathan Harker's perspective. The whole story is told in a compilation of the different protagonists and people who run up against Dracula at different times over the story and eventually join their efforts to try to take him down. But you get diary entries from Jonathan, you get diary entries and letters from Mina, you get log entries and clinical reports from Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, who we'll talk about in a bit, as well as logs by one of his pupils who runs a sanatorium, and others. We have one sequence that's told through the daily ship logs of the Demeter, which is the name of the vessel that Dracula sneaks on to have himself transported down from Transylvania to London, where ultimately his plans are to come to fruition, as we see. So in Mina's case, we see Jonathan's subsequent trauma and struggles from his ordeal in Castle Dracula told through Mina's perspectives. So there's a lot of deep compassion and sympathy that she feels for him. She describes him having moments where he doesn't really seem to be all the way present in the moment, as if his mind just for no reason suddenly travels thousands of miles away, or he wakes up screaming in the night. Just a lot of very, very scary and painful moments. So we see that the traumatic experience that he went through is definitely causing a lot of flashbacks and a lot of continued hindrances and suffering that's making it difficult for him to function on a daily sense. One moment that I've always been struck by in the story is that sometime after he and Mina are back in London together, they're relaxing on a park bench when Jonathan suddenly sees Count Dracula, who's made it now at this point to London as well too, just loitering across the street. And it's unclear whether or not the Count notices them, but Jonathan sees him. And even though the Count's appearance is visibly different now, he's actually used his powers to grow young again, and he's wearing different clothing, Jonathan recognizes him immediately. This, to me, as a clinician, speaks to a concept in trauma where how a trigger works is that when we go through a traumatic experience, a very specific part of our brain gets activated. It's a sequence of or a special enzyme that gets pushed up to in the part of the brain what we call the synapse, between the neural synapses. And this enzyme acts as kind of a what you might call a bypass to the way our emotional brain versus our rational brain starts to process and interpret information from the world around us. So all this is to say, whenever we encounter something that is similar, if not identical, to the original source of our trauma, that same synapse fires up again and creates the same chain reaction that we experience and other people perceive as a trigger episode, which can be everything from stress to palpitations in our heart to sweating, labored breathing, sudden anger, fear, etc., all those different specifics. Jonathan has that because of that synapse, I think, was getting activated in his brain at that point. He instantly recognizes the Count. He's not even fooled for a moment by the disguise, because that part of his brain that went through that trauma is lighting up a storm and warning him that, hey, he's back, watch out. So it's a great example of a PTSD episode in action as being told from a very different time period than how we view it in today. It's not really until Jonathan meets with Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, who I mentioned earlier, that he is able to start to recover more fully. Van Helsing is a character who's really at the center of the efforts to fight back against Dracula. We're first introduced to him by one of his, I think I mentioned his pupils earlier. I forget his name. I think it's Jack, or it might be Arthur. I forget which of the two it is. But anyway, it's the one who runs the sanatorium, who's previously a student that Van Helsing taught. And he contacts Van Helsing because he's trying to make sense of these strange episodes of people in London getting bitten in the night and losing blood somehow. So Van Helsing shows up because he's an expert in, what is the medical term for that? Hematology, I think. Doctors, if you're listening to this, feel free to correct me. But whatever the specialization of having to do with blood and blood labs and that kind of thing is, that's Van Helsing's area of expertise, as also, I believe, being an expert on foreign animal diseases, if I'm remembering this correctly. Anyway, Van Helsing comes in and takes a look at the strange cases that his pupil is showing him and quickly puts together that this is something far beyond the usual things, that phenomena that he's used to dealing with. And eventually he comes to the conclusion that we've got a vampire on the loose. It's a Nosferatu invasion. And it's crazy to think about. There's actually a lot of sections in the story where Van Helsing, admits, like, yeah, this is crazy. I know we're all about science and reason, and yet here we are being confronted with this situation that nothing but an explanation outside our normal areas of science can account for. And Van Helsing eventually learns about Jonathan through an acquaintance of Mina's. In fact, I believe, so it's to make a long story short, one of Mina's best friends is engaged to a friend of Van Helsing's pupil. So it's a bit of, traveling through the grapevine. But eventually Van Helsing gets word about Mina and Jonathan and learns of Jonathan's ordeal that he suffered in Castle Dracula. And Helsing is, he needs data. He wants to learn as much as possible about this mysterious enemy that he's going up against. So he contacts Jonathan, writes him a letter asking to meet with him, saying that he's heard briefly of his account and believes him and wants to learn more. And this right here is huge because it gives Jonathan what, as a therapist, and again, I'll get more into this too when I talk about a meeting with him and treating him, is so crucial for survivors of trauma, which is emotional validation. What's important here too to note is that this validation that Van Helsing gives Jonathan is unprompted. He doesn't have to ask for it. He doesn't have to tell his story first, and volunteer that pain that he's keeping in from this terrible experience that he's been through. Van Helsing just says to him flat out, I believe you. No, even though he's a total stranger, there's no doubt, there's no dismissiveness, there's just validation. And that plays a big, big role in allowing Jonathan to ultimately rally enough to first help Van Helsing and then help the others eventually take down the Count in the story's climax. But that validation, we see its power on display because literally the day after Jonathan receives receives Van Helsing's letter, and then Van Helsing comes to meet him at the hotel where he and Mina are staying, Van Helsing says, I'm surprised to see you, so up and about and apparently full of energy. I mean, after what I'd heard about what you went through, I was expecting you to still be bedridden at the least. I've heard you've been sick and really struggling since you got back. And Jonathan says, just reading your letter, just getting confirmation that you believed me and that you were willing to take me at my word, and that more so you want to help me and meet with me. That alone has just made such a difference. I'm feeling so much better now already. And I was struck by that even back then. I think when I first read this story and heard about, the tale of Jonathan and Dracula, even then, that portion of it really stuck out to me. And it's since then been, I think, just a wonderful example of the power of validation when you're trying to be supportive of somebody who's been through a traumatic experience. Because that's what's so hard about trauma, is that many times, as Jonathan demonstrates, even to the person experiencing it, it doesn't always feel real. It can feel almost stupid for some people to say it out loud, that this is what they feel they went through or what happened. And yet it is real. And the best thing we can do to begin them to help heal and begin that healing journey is to acknowledge the reality of it. That, yeah, no matter how crazy it was, no matter how duplicitous or mysterious or incredible it may seem, to the average person in the street, yeah, this is real. This is what you went through. And I believe you, even if others don't. And I want to help do what I can for you. That's what Van Helsing does. And we see that Jonathan really is able to bounce back a little more from that. So getting into the diagnosis, if you've listened to any episodes on this show so far, I think you can probably guess where this is going. It is post-traumatic stress disorder for the diagnosis. Now, it's not complex PTSD. I will give a little leeway to the cliche Daniel and I joke about a lot on here. And that I'm not going to say it's complex PTSD because it really is just one traumatic experience in particular that is the source of Jonathan's struggles. That said, I would label it as a severe case of PTSD because the symptoms are very extreme, especially in the beginning. Everything that I listed before, you have physical, his physical health is impacted, his ability to function throughout the day. He needs a lot of rest, a lot of just not pushing himself, the flashbacks, the memory lapses, the questioning of reality, and the avoidance. So it is a pretty extreme case of PTSD, but I wouldn't say it's complex or chronic. So using that as our diagnosis to then go into treatment, as his therapist, I would start with, similar to Van Helsing, further validation of his trauma. I'd want to make sure I open with that. And I wouldn't want to come across as, overbearing, like I'm, overly enthusiastic or, using it as a pretext to try to pressure him to open up about it. No, I wouldn't take that approach, but I would be firm, in affirming for him that I believe it's real too. And I'm willing to listen to him without judgment and just convey to him that if he wants to talk more about his experience, this is a space where he can do so. So starting with that, we'd probably then go into more psychoeducation about the trauma. I'd teach him about how to understand flashbacks, how to understand where the avoidance comes in, or, look at his reasons for why it may have seemed so extreme and incredible to talk about even afterwards, and look at ways to further overcome that obstacle. One thing that Jonathan has shown is that he's, even under traumatic circumstances, he's still capable of coping through journaling, which is, of course, a wonderful therapeutic skill that many clinicians still assign today. So I would probably use that. I would say, let's, maybe we could construct a trauma narrative, do some TFCBT, and use his journal as a basis. We might look at continuing the journal entries, going back and taking from previous journal entries and putting those, as part of a project to create a new written narrative, maybe compiling a personal essay that takes all of them into account, but also adds a more positive ending based on the final showdown with the Count that Jonathan and his friends go through. So looking at that, I think the power of the written word is clearly something Jonathan is familiar with and knows how to use. So therapy would be hopefully a space that we can expand upon that. In addition to that, I would look at coping skills like meditation or guided breathing to help with the physical symptoms if he still has any. Using guided breathing can be really great when it comes to lowering the bodily stress and anxiety. Even if it doesn't necessarily overwrite the trauma at its core, it's a great way to begin the stabilization process. Same goes for meditation. I think because of how hard it was for him to admit to himself the nature of what he'd been through. Even if he's appreciative of my validation, it might be a while before he's ready to talk about it with me. So honoring that and just allowing for calmness and safety to come about and be communicated in other forms. I've done this with some clients. I've actually had clients where rather than do a ton of psychoeducation and trauma deep dives, we would just draw in session. If it was some of the teen clients I've worked with or children clients, we'd draw, we'd do some poetry writing, or in Jonathan's case, we may have him do some open journaling in session together. And that could be how we spend the time. And the only other thing I'd say I'd mention too is that I'd probably want to get a release of authorization to share his progress in therapy and his health information with Dr. Van Helsing, so as to be able to do cross collaboration, since Van Helsing is very familiar with his situation as well and is also a friend. It might be a good idea to have that as an additional professional resource, as well as keeping that line of communication open between them. I think having that as extra support source could go a long way too. It's also possible that if his physical symptoms weren't able to be brought under control or got worse again, that I might look into getting him a psychiatry referral for medication to help with the sleeping or some of the worse anxiety if it was becoming clear that the trauma was still severe enough that basic soothing wasn't going to be enough to stabilize it. But, I think that actually is less likely to be an issue, because we also learn about Jonathan throughout the story is that he's got a lot of resilience. Despite everything that he goes through, he is able to bounce back. He is able to rally, and that he actually discovers he has quite a bit of hidden strength that even he probably wasn't aware he had. Mina herself writes in her own diary entries how in awe she is of the strength and determination that Jonathan later exhibits when he's taking the reverse role and going back with the others to try to hunt down the Count this time and stop his plans and take him out for good. So I think that with the initial support of coping and validation and everything that I've talked about, he's likely to respond very well to therapy. As I said at the beginning of the episode, he's very open-minded, even if he's not always easily convinced right off the bat. He's curious, and we know that he is someone who responds well to validation and the opportunity to be heard. So I think, as his therapist, practicing active listening and doing my best to build up a strong rapport with him. If we're able to do that, then I think a lot of the remaining pieces will fall into place. Probably without too much hindrance, even if there are some extra steps that go into that. All this is to say, I definitely imagine working with him to be both similar and different to a lot of the other trauma cases I have. And I think that being able to overcome the fears and the physical burdens that trauma leaves us with, as Daniel and I have talked about in other episodes, can really lead to some truly beautiful growth down the line, post-traumatic growth, as we've referred to it. And Jonathan is also a wonderful example of that, with his growth and his strength that he shows for his family and his friends in rallying back from everything that he's been through. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you all next time on Therapy by the Book.